And I think where we'd like to start is your assessment of Assemblyman Rich Gordon and how you would bring a different style or a different political approach to being the representative for the 24th District than he has been.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, I have I have great respect for Rich Gordon, admirer of his work, and had the pleasure of working with Rich on an assembly bill back in 2014, AB 1690, which was a request on the part of the City of Menlo Park to amend the state housing element law in a way that gave more flexibility to cities to be able to put some mixed use in these high density housing sites that we were zoning as part of the housing element compliance. The request came out of, we wanted to put a grocery store in the first floor of a housing site, more amenities, make it much more of a live, work, play type of an environment. And the state housing element at that time said you can't count that site toward your housing quota, and which just didn't make a whole lot of sense. Rich Gordon agreed. He in fact put together a committee of council members from up and down the peninsula to get other recommendations related to the housing element. That specific recommendation made it into a bill that he not only put forward, but got bipartisan support and was signed by the governor. It was a near unanimous vote in both houses of the assembly. And it just, it was one of those things that gave local control back to our communities, and was certainly a solution which I appreciated his work and collaborating with him on it. So I always liked Rich, liked working with him. I probably diverge a little bit in that I have more of a finance and numbers background, and I certainly think that one of the key challenges that we have now in the state, obviously we have major challenges in transportation infrastructure, the high cost of housing, and all sorts of issues that the state faces. And quite frankly, all of those have to be funded, have to be financed in some way, and so a lot of the issue now is how do you actually address the infrastructure changes and requirements and be able to do that and still be within the state's budget and be able to do it within the current resources that the state has from current taxes.
So is there anything about Rich Gordon's record or performance that you disagree with? Or that rises to the level of criticism?
No, in general, as I mentioned, he's also been very receptive when we've had any issues, and so I don't have any criticism of Rich. I think he's been a fine representative for our district.
So Sacramento is not exactly a bipartisan place. You're the one Republican in this race.
Correct.
I can't remember the last time this area sent a Republican to Sacramento. Becky Morgan is probably the last one.
Right. Tom Campbell in the state senate.
Yeah.
Point, so.
So what makes you think that you can win a race in this district, I guess, is the first question. And
sure.
I suppose your chances diminished a bit with Trump's securing the nomination. But explain a little bit as to the nature of your political affiliation as a Republican and what that really reflects about your political viewpoints in the context of this race.
Yeah, sure. I have been a Republican because I believe in limited government and I believe strongly in the creativity of the private sector and the ability to strike a balance and be able to, and so that's, you know, been sort of core to that. But having said that, my actual experience in being on, for example, the Menlo Park City Council for the last 6 years is that I've been able to develop a reputation of being a bipartisan problem solver. As you know, we have a mixed city council in terms of political affiliation, and that really doesn't enter many of our discussions and issues. We have very similar perspectives on a lot of things, and I think part of that has to do with, it's less about the party and more about my specific background as being more of a numbers guy. So I've earned the respect of my fellow council members. I'm the budget guy. You know, I've solved our and balanced our budget a couple of times during my 6 year. Well, the budget's been balanced, but there were 2 years in particular. First year where we would have had a $800,000 deficit by paying down our unfunded pension liability. We actually saved taxpayers $3.6 million in what would have been interest expense that the city would have paid CalPERS on that liability, and that actually closed the budget gap, and we were able to have a balanced budget for, in fact, the entire time. It closed what had been called a structural budget deficit.
Well, I guess my question more is a political question.
Well, so it does go back into politics, because I do think, particularly on economic issues, I believe this district is far more moderate than perhaps the registration stats would indicate. And I'll give you the prime example was pension reform and Measure L passing in 2010 in Menlo Park, over 65%. It passed in San Jose in 2012, a different form. There has often been bipartisan consensus around certain issues that are economic in nature, that are budget in nature, and I do think there are, and I think because of that, I think people understand that, and depending on the particular election or the particular year, I think people do see past the labels, and this area is, as I mentioned, I think far more moderate, and they're looking for, I think, different and innovative solutions. I think that's the key.
Can we ask you some questions about the housing situation with regard to what you think the role of the state should be to deal with this current problem with the high cost of housing, high rents that are driving a lot of people out of our area? Do you have views on that, what the state should be doing about that?
Well, so I do think one of the key solutions to the housing crisis is to be able to locate housing, particularly, 1-2 bedroom near a workplace, so that we have the jobs housing balance, and in particular. What, for example, we did in Menlo Park was, as part of our general plan update, is to start putting housing and zone for housing near areas where we're seeing high job growth, particularly Facebook, and then create basically live, work, play zones. Now, that is something that I think makes a lot more sense. It is creating more housing. It will create more housing supply. 3,500 units just that Facebook is looking at in terms of the areas under the general plan that they're looking at, which will be right near and close to their campus. It'll include grocery store, it'll include amenities, and really it'll get people out of cars. It helps to reduce the commute for their potential employees in the future. And it's a good way to address the housing needs, because in San Mateo County, 50,000 new jobs were created in the last 10 years, and only 2,000 or 3,000 units of housing in that same period. So that's now. starting to move forward. In Menlo Park, we have close to 2,000 housing units under construction. And trying to find that right balance makes sense. Now, to go to the state's role, the state had previously allowed us through redevelopment agency funding to be able to utilize 20% of that toward affordable housing. And back in the last recession, the governor took away the RDAs from us, and so from us as cities, and there has not been a replacement of a funding mechanism for affordable housing. So again, here's an issue where trying to figure out how to do that is a key aspect. I think everyone would like to see affordable housing, would like to see more of it, but how you fund it is a key challenge, and I do think the state can help in that.
I want to better understand what you believe the state's role is versus municipal control. You've obviously spent many years now from the municipal perspective dealing with state mandates.
Yeah.
So what is your view? And Menlo Park, of course, had an unfortunate run-in regarding the housing element that it's paid dearly for. But just what is, in your judgment, what changes are needed, if any, with the ABAG housing allocation system? And do you think the state needs to be more aggressive in its mandates of local government or less?
Thank you for asking that question, because I spent a good year, in fact, the year that I was mayor, we spent much of our time working on the housing element during that very difficult year of doing that. And we spent over $1 million, in fact close to $1.4 million of city funds in order to put together the housing element and comply with basically 2 RHNA rounds, regional housing needs allocation rounds, and comply with the state's housing element law. To me, that was an example of where the state it's a best example, in my opinion, of an unfunded state mandate, where it was so prescriptive about what you had to build, where you had to build it, and what qualified for the housing quota numbers, that in many ways as a city we had an arm tied behind our back as we're trying to go through and do this. So one example was the one I mentioned about wanting to have some flexibility to put a grocery store in there, but also it required one type of high density housing that would qualify for the numbers. We wanted to do also count more second units because those were affordable, but to this day continue to have great difficulty to get that qualified under the state housing element. I do not think that prescriptive top-down quota mandate is particularly effective. Every city up and down the peninsula have wrestled and complained with it, and yet every city is working hard on trying to get housing into their cities. So we, in fact, in Menlo Park, turned out we spent a whole year on that, where we would have been a year ahead in the general plan update process if we didn't have to do that. And under the general plan process, we're actually zoning for more housing, almost 2 or 3 times more housing than we did under the housing element. So we would have already been done with the general plan update if we hadn't had to spend a year.
Yeah, I think the proponents of the system that exists now would argue that cities would not be doing what they're doing if it weren't for the pressure that they're under from those mandates. And of course, one of the problems with them is that they don't actually require you to build any housing. They just want to see in your zoning plan that you've got enough land zoned to create that housing. And while we're on, before we leave this subject, the state has done nothing to tie creation of new employment to the creation of new housing. So what we have up and down the peninsula, as you articulated earlier, the creation of far more commercial office developments and the generation of way more employees than we're ever going to catch up, no less get ahead on the housing side of the equation. So people in municipal government keep approving new commercial development projects which attract more inbound commuters, and you don't replace that, you don't provide for that with more housing. So how do we get out of this downward cycle of more jobs, and then now that puts pressure on more housing, which then leads to then the creation of more jobs, and it's just a never-ending cycle?
Well, I do think there's been a very strong recognition on the part of many of the city governments that, and we've seen that in the last couple of years, of the need for more housing that is workforce housing and close to where the jobs are. This live, work, play balance of jobs, housing is become a mantra for many of the cities up and down the peninsula over the last couple of years. So you're right. I think there was a period of time where many of the cities were looking at commercial office in a vacuum, and I think now it's becoming apparent that that we do need more housing closer to where these jobs are. So the 1950s sort of industrial zone where you would put all of the offices in one area of the town is now turning into these sort of mixed-use districts, and and we have catching up to do. There's no question about it. But I think this is where we've made great strides in getting there, because we are close to a housing. We're getting closer to that that balance, at least through the efforts that we're doing in our general plan. And I'm not sure. I think the state could be more beneficial if they could provide a funding stream of somehow that can help in terms of the address the affordable aspect of it, because I do think between the private sector and cities we're able to get workforce and housing built that is at the more sort of moderate and higher affordability. The issue is, I think the difficulty that we have is on the affordable housing side.
Do you think anything needs to be done with regard to rent control at the state level? Because, like in Bellhaven, a lot of those homes are single-family rented homes, and they are not governed by the state law with regard to rent stabilization, And so do you think there should be any changes with regard to that to protect the renters who are maybe being pushed out of Bellhaven because of Facebook?
Well, I do think that's more of a local issue, because there are, quite frankly, the state is so big and it's got so many different areas where, and the issue of rapidly increasing rents are more in particular areas such as the peninsula and the Bay Area. So again, one of the difficulties I have is when the state has with good intentions tries to pass a state law, and it actually doesn't fit or apply or has unintended consequences for many areas of the state where it doesn't apply. That's why I'm a stronger believer that you should address more of these issues at the local level rather than necessarily at the state level. And it also gives more opportunity for different types of solutions to come up, different type of policies. Each city will have a different approach, and I think that actually helps us, because then we start seeing the best practices that one city may be doing and be able to adopt that. And that's certainly what we will be looking at in Menlo Park, is we're going to be looking at what some of the other cities have been doing to address it. And
so to this point that you're raising about the tension between local control and state control, let me ask you about a few issues that all kind of hit on that. The first is the issue of who should determine policy regarding the use of police footage, video footage through body cams and police car cameras. We're in an age of video, obviously, and now we're very close to the point where most police departments in California will have some kind of video that is recording their interactions with the public. The state has not, as of yet, under a lot of pressure from law enforcement, done anything other than protective measures for privacy purposes to develop a uniform policy about this. And instead, each community is going about trying to sort this out. Is that the appropriate place for policies to be developed, in your mind, for this kind of example of law enforcement video? That each community should decide on their own what should be made public, when, and under what circumstances?
When you have new technology being deployed, I do actually think it is helpful for different local jurisdictions to apply, roll it out, and at a certain point of time, and I think we're there. There are enough cities that have adopted policies. We adopted a policy a year and a half ago about what is the video retention time, that I think there's enough information now that it then does make sense for the state to adopt one that then other cities who have not yet either adopted the technology or have adopted the technology but haven't set up a policy can then, and I do think there's an advantage on, at that point, the state providing a guideline and a baseline that other cities can adopt. I do think that does help.
So just to clarify, you're saying that we've reached the point where the state should step in and regulate these. You said you used the word guidelines.
Yes, I do think that we are at the point where the state can play a role by setting a baseline policy for those jurisdictions that have not already adopted a video retention policy, and that it should be a baseline.
When you say baseline, what do you mean?
So, for example, the state may say that can set a baseline of say that the city can only retain the video for, let's say, if certain cities have said that the police can only retain the video for up to 6 months, it may make sense, and some of them have shorter, unless there's an investigation required. The state may do something that, for example, might be 9 months, or something that is a base threshold that then applies to all of the other counties.
Are you referring to license plate reading, that issue?
That's part of that.
Because there's a lot of different issues
yes,
here.
You're right.
One is the license plate reading data, which obviously certain advocates would say the police shouldn't be able to retain that for very long. But there's also the issue of the release of video that is taken of crimes, of police engagement in their law enforcement duties. So,
body camera.
Right.
Yes. Right. So what I was talking about was so right now we've set a policy where any engagement with the public, we've asked our police officers, we require police officers to turn on. So there is video being collected every day for a routine traffic stop, for other types of things. Right. And it's with respect to how long are we allowed, or is our police allowed to keep that video unless there's an investigation going on. And that's where we have set a threshold of time.
Okay. So my question is simply, should the state step in and not allow cities to all have different policies about all these things? And I think your answer is after an initial period where everybody's experimenting, that should happen.
Right. Okay. And then the state sets a a particular level that then encourages the adoption through the rest of the state.
Okay. The other another issue that I assume familiar with, the Martins Beach coastal issue with the access to Martin Lane. Are you familiar with that lawsuit?
Not really, no.
This is the property on the coast, right on the beach, that historically had been open. Right. Historically had been open to the public, an access road. New owner closes the access road, and the state legislature stepped in and passed a law that essentially mandates that road be open under the Coastal Act, and there's a battle over that. Is that type of action something that you support on the part of the state in attempting to guarantee or to provide public access, or would you tilt towards the private property rights of a new owner of a property being able to close that?
I think that depends upon, so I am somewhat familiar with it, but have not been involved with the history or the particulars of it. So if there has previously been access to the beach, and it's been over a period of years, and even if it isn't necessarily there hasn't been an easement, a formal easement.
Oh, there definitely has.
Right.
Yeah.
The issue is that at a certain point it does become there is almost a public right that is established over, particularly if it's a long period of years. And if that is the case, then there is some role to allow that access to continue. Having said that, I think it would be far better to work out some sort of a compromise that still allows that access, but also maintains both the privacy and the private property rights of the new owner. And I much prefer something that's more of a negotiated type settlement than necessarily the state having to impose it.
Right. And then a third area that I want to ask you about quickly is arbitration clauses in both contracts and employment agreements and personnel policies. This has been an issue that the trial lawyers have been pushing really hard for in Sacramento to not allow arbitration clauses in day-to-day contracts, which are situations where the public is just checking a box saying they agree to certain terms and conditions of, say, getting a credit card or use of software, where they're agreeing that they'll settle any disputes via arbitration. I'm more interested, though, in your view of arbitration as a emerging standard for personnel policies, so that in the case of employers who are trying to make a more efficient and less costly way of resolving employee conflicts, they've built that into their personnel policies. And this is now sort of the standard recommendation of employment lawyers, is to do that. Do you have a view on that issue of arbitration clauses and the use of arbitration?
Well, in my private sector experience, I think arbitration clauses in commercial contracts in general have been a good thing, because it has lowered the cost of potential litigation involved. So as you mentioned, when you sign a license, or there might be an arbitration clause in there, and it's rarely used, but if it is used, it helps to, in effect, lower the cost of the service and that's being provided. But I will say that, being on the city council for the last couple of years, we have had issues with arbitration, mandatory arbitration, as part of our public employee
arbitration is a whole nother matter. Yeah.
And that's where it's become a very different issue, where it has actually not been beneficial, I think, to and those have often have been in the context of whether it's employee conduct or employee policy, as well as economic and pay raise issues.
Sure.
That are obviously, and so going back to an employer, I have mixed issues on that, and I think I'd probably say that I don't think I've made up my mind yet on whether arbitration in employment.
Well, also, I think there really is a big difference between a union environment where arbitration is part of your union contract and a private employer who's basically laying out an alternative process.
Right.
Maybe we can ask some questions about education funding, and if you have any thoughts about the inequities in terms of financing, comparing like Ravenswood District with the Palo Alto District and so forth. Do you think the state needs to take any new steps in that direction to try to create greater equity among the districts?
Well, I do think I do think between Proposition 98 and many where we're allocating much of the surpluses the last couple of years to replenish the education funding that was taken away during the leaner years, I think that's been necessary and has helped a lot of those districts. Versus what's now called community-funded districts, which are based on local property taxes, and I think that mechanism is good, and that makes sense. The one thing that I would change is under Proposition 30. There was an agreement made where school districts are not allowed to set aside funding that their board thinks makes sense to set up a reserve for capital improvements. And there was a cap put on that. And I believe that we have a aging infrastructure issue with our schools. Now, certainly many of our more affluent school districts, not all community-funded districts, but the ones that are in more affluent areas, are able to pass parcel taxes that can help fund. But I'm noticing, for example, where a good example is the Ravenswood School District will need funding to upgrade and update their schools. And in fact, we help in one of the classes at the Bellhaven School, and I think the teachers there do a great job. But definitely the quality of the classroom and the infrastructure at that school is not the same as the newly built schools that are in other parts of just Menlo Park. And so the capital improvement issue is something where I do think whether it's the state or through potentially city public benefit type negotiations can potentially help to create a source of funding for those districts to help address the aging infrastructure. And I do believe that has a significant factor in the perception of whether you've got equal schools by just simply the condition of the infrastructure itself.
But you think the current funding system for the basic educational program in terms of these inequities is on the way to being resolved then, even though we're paying teachers in poorer districts way less than neighboring districts and the money spent per student is very different?
The hard part is already the funding is a big part of the state's budget, and how much more of are we able to act as that the state, I should say, to address the inequality. I think there has to be other ways to do it. So it may require, for example, more public-private partnerships to where local employers and businesses can help support some of the funding needs in some of the poor districts. The issues, the state budget and the state funding sources are. It's hard to see additional funding going to that.
Yeah.
So I hear the issue does need to be addressed. I think we need to find other ways to fund that, and that includes the capital improvement issue.
And what about the university system in California, which has gone from being very affordable to now being as expensive as a lot of private schools, and is keeping a lot of students from being able to attend a state university? What, as a numbers guy, how are you going to solve that problem?
Well, so one of the things that has bothered me recently is some of the statistics that have come out that have shown this rather large increase in non-California resident admissions as a way of in effect increasing tuition funds and rates.
They would argue as a way of keeping tuition from increasing even more for in-state.
And that goes against sort of the mission of the and what I think the constituency of the California university system. So,
but it's big dollars.
Sure. And I do think one of the interesting approaches is, for example, the community college district in San Mateo County putting housing for faculty on some of their campus sites as a way of being able to provide benefits to their faculty and to offset the increasing cost of housing. And in many ways that helps to create basically a benefit that can help when it comes to their overall budget issues and continuing to retain the faculty that they need.
So you think this is a problem that needs to be solved primarily on the cost side then, to basically control costs or bring costs of the system down through techniques like that, and that as opposed to a revenue solution?
I do think, so on the revenue side, it also depends upon their particular. In the case of the community college, they're on a county-wide district, and I think voters have been generally receptive and supportive of bond measures to support the community college district. And here again on the UC level, I do think there have been there are limits to how much the state general fund can support. That doesn't mean that there aren't alternative ways of providing funding, and I do think some of it is on the cost side. I do think administrator costs have seen this sort of ratchet effect,
right.
and unfortunately many of the chancellors are at very high levels of compensation relative to where I think the faculty are. So I do think there can be things done on the cost side as well as trying to find alternate funding.
Mm-hmm. Back on the secondary education thing, bond measures can pass under Prop 39 with 55% voter approval. Would you support providing the same provision for parcel taxes, which require 2/3 voter approval? Would you?
I think I probably, I haven't really thought too much about it because I look at those as particular thresholds that show at least a not just a strong but an overwhelming support for bond, and I think that's a good thing. The question, though, is whether 65% is too high. It probably is too high a threshold. So it may be more like 55 or 60%. But I do think, as I've thought of, as we're talking about it, I do think that there should be some changes on where that threshold is set.
What changes would you support at the state level with regards to the education code and teacher tenure?
So there are a couple of things. One is reducing the number of, a lot of the school districts face a lot of mandates from Sacramento. There, in fact, at one time was, I think, something like over 100 different mandates, and at least it's been reduced, but it's still over 30 that schools have to comply with and are the sources of funding for particular types of programs. So I do think that there's a need for more simplification, and therefore it makes it easier for our school districts to actually receive that additional funding to which they're eligible for. And on the teacher tenure side, I do believe that a longer period should be required before teachers get tenure. I do believe that while by and large I know in our school district we have great teachers, and very much respect and admire the jobs that they do every day. They work hard for our kids. I think school district administrators should have the latitude that if there is one or two teachers that aren't quite working out, that they should have the ability to dismiss those particular teachers. I do think they should have a little more authority and ability to do that. Again, most of our teachers I think are great. They work hard, but I do think it's important that there is still a accountability mechanism to ensure that there's strong performance across the board. So, and that includes the tuition. That includes the tenure issue.
Right. So on these two issues, that you say you'd like to increase the tenure, it's now 2 years, which essentially means 18 months or so.
Right.
What would you want to change that to?
I'd probably see it more like 5 years, because I think it takes. So it always takes at least a year for someone to even, in any job, and I think their true expertise in the job, in a particular career track, is really after like 5 years. We see it, for example, in our firefighters. Generally, when they go to captain level, they can go to captain a little bit earlier, but generally it's like 5 years often, because the expertise that's required, the art of the job aspects, and that's where I see the value to tenure as a retention mechanism to make sure we're keeping strong teachers. So I would like to see us at least try that level and see how that works.
And then on the performance side, once a teacher does have tenure, this issue of how incredibly difficult it is to get rid of a bad teacher.
Right.
Do you have anything specific in mind as to how you would make that more achievable for a school district with the union?
Well, I do think that the school district should have some latitude to dismiss poorly performing teachers after due process, thorough review, and investigation.
Right.
Rather than right now, what happens is poorly performing teachers get transferred and to different schools within the district. And I think there needs to be the ability for the school district that, again, after due process, after due investigation, and
well, of course, the union would say, well, there already is that capability. Nothing is standing in the way for a school district getting rid of a teacher that's not performing.
It's rare to see. So I do think that the district should have the ability to actually. Because the cost of going through the current process is also very prohibitive for many school districts. So there is a spectrum, right? And I do think that there is a level in which that it can be set so that school districts do have the ability, but yet it's still fair to the teachers themselves.
Did you seek any union or organizational support?
I did not.
So did you fill out their questionnaires at all?
I started going through it, but
you got worn out?
Yeah, it was very extensive, and And there are many questions where I didn't agree with and didn't feel right about putting in some answers, so I did not I didn't finish the forms.
And your funding for your campaign is obviously trailing others significantly. I wonder if you think that that's going to impair your chances for being elected, and what you attribute your level of funding to.
Sure. Well, first of all, I came into the race fairly late, just near the end of basically at the end of the year, and fact of the matter is I also have a day job and I have a city council job, so I don't have and yet I'm still trying to campaign. So now you add, trying to, so I'll be perfectly frank, I just haven't had as much time to devote to fundraising as perhaps some of the other candidates. A couple of the candidates quit their jobs, they're working, they're campaigning full time, and of course they're able to do more fundraising. Will it impact my campaign? Potentially, there's no question, but I'm also doing more targeting in my which has served me very well. High propensity voters in the district, and I think I'm able to be pretty effective in my campaigns on in effect a shoestring budget. I think, so I think it'll work out okay. So.
Good. Well, thank you very much for coming in. We enjoyed talking to you.